How do you sleep at night knowing that a little girl, a little disabled girl, was cut into pieces and thrown away?
Segment 1. Zara Baker. Zara Baker came into the world in Australia in the year 2000, and almost from her first breath, life handed her burdens no child should have to carry. Cancer took hold of her body before she'd even reached kindergarten age, and by 5 years old, she'd already lost part of a leg to the disease, learning to walk again on a prosthetic limb, while other kids her age were just learning to ride bikes. What made her remarkable wasn't the hardship. It was how she carried it. People who knew her, teachers, neighbors, family, friends, all say the same thing. This was a kid who smiled through it, relentlessly upbeat, the kind of resilience that made grown adults feel a little more capable of handling their own problems. Then her father, Adam Baker, remarried. His new wife, an American woman named Elisa, brought Zara and the family across the ocean to settle in North Carolina. On paper, it looked like the beginning of a better chapter, a fresh start, a stable home, a chance for a girl who'd already fought so hard to finally just be a kid. That is not what happened. On October 9th, 2012, Adam and Elisa called police to report that Zara had vanished from their home in Hickory, North Carolina. Elisa had a story ready, an elaborate one. She claimed someone had left a ransom note, demanding cash, and she tied it back to a supposed grudge connected to Adam's workplace. For a brief window, law enforcement treated it exactly like what it appeared to be, a kidnapping. News vans rolled in. Volunteers combed nearby wooded areas. Amber-style alerts blanketed the region. But almost immediately, the story started to fall apart at the seams. Investigators noticed something strange about that ransom note. It was oddly precise in some places and clumsy in others, like someone had tried too hard to make it look authentic. When forensic examiners got their hands on it, they traced the paper stock back to a notebook. Elisa's notebook. There was no kidnapper. There never had been. And when she was hooked up to a polygraph, she failed almost instantly. That's when the neighbors and teachers started talking. And what they described was disturbing. Zara had shown up to school before with injuries nobody could explain. She'd been kept home from school for stretches that raised eyebrows. At one point, a social worker had actually been called to check on her. Elisa's answer for all of it was that Zara was simply too sick, too delicate to be out and about. The real explanation was far uglier. 2 weeks into the search, investigators got the break that changed everything, and it was gruesome. A prosthetic leg turned up in a wooded area outside town. Serial numbers confirmed what everyone feared. It belonged to Zara. From there, the search transformed into something out of a nightmare. Searchers began recovering human remains scattered across Caldwell County. A bone fragment in one spot, a piece of skull in another. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a body dumped in haste. This was deliberate, methodical dismemberment. Faced with the evidence piling up against her, Elisa Baker finally broke. She admitted to writing the fake ransom note herself and confessed to helping hide what had happened to Zara. But true to form, she tried to push the blame elsewhere, insisting Adam had actually killed his daughter and that she'd merely helped cover it up afterward. Adam denied every word of it. Investigators never found evidence linking him to the killing, and he was never charged in connection with Zara's death. Whatever happened in that house, the legal responsibility landed squarely on Elisa. Here's the part that makes this case even harder to sit with. Zara's death wasn't sudden. The evidence pointed to an extended period of abuse and neglect leading up to it. Court records painted a picture of Elisa as a woman battling a painkiller addiction, with a history of troubled relationships and, critically, no biological bond to the child in her care. Zara wasn't treated like a daughter. She was treated like a burden, an inconvenience Elisa resented having to deal with. The courtroom proceedings that followed were bleak. In 2013, Elisa Baker pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and charges tied directly to how Zara's body had been dismembered. Her sentence came out to somewhere between 15 and 18 years for the killing itself, stacked with an additional decade for unrelated federal drug charges. Do the math, and you're looking at a maximum of well under 30 years for a crime this horrific. For a lot of people following the case, that felt like an insult. Zara's biological mother, still in Australia and still fighting through the courts for custody rights when this all unfolded, said what so many people were already thinking, that no number of years behind bars could ever make up for what had been taken from her daughter. The anger this case sparked wasn't only about the violence. It was about the betrayal underneath it. Zara Baker had already beaten cancer once. She'd already learned to walk again on a new leg. She'd faced down more suffering than most people face in a lifetime, and she'd done it smiling. And then the one person who was supposed to shield her from any more harm, the woman she called Mom, ended her life in the cruelest way imaginable. The press had a label ready almost immediately: the evil stepmother. Elisa's mugshot, cold, defiant, became shorthand for that betrayal. Even now, people revisit this case and can't quite make peace with it. How did Adam not see it? Why didn't social services step in sooner when the warning signs were sitting right there in plain view? And above everything else, how does a child who survived so much end up destroyed, not by the illness she'd already beaten, but by the very woman who was supposed to love her? Zara was cremated, and part of her ashes made the long journey back home to Australia, where her family built a lasting memorial. Back in North Carolina, a community garden now stands in her honor. Flowers, butterflies, all the things that echo the joy she somehow held onto through everything she endured. But Elisa Baker will be remembered for something else entirely. Not just as a killer, but as a real-world version of the villain kids are warned about in bedtime stories, the wicked stepmother. Except there was no storybook ending here. This actually happened, and its aftershocks reached from a small town in North Carolina all the way across the world to Australia.
And when I told the police what I had discovered about her past, she was just like, I can't believe you would tell them that. And I told him, I said, I had nothing to hide, and I didn't think that you did either.
Segment 2, Taylor Searing. Before we continue, if you're new here, this is Daily Crime Archive, and we cover the true stories the headlines rush past. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we've got cases coming that will stay with you. And when I told the police what I'd found out about her past, she looked at me and said, I can't believe you'd tell them that. And I told her, you had nothing to hide. I didn't think you did either. Texas, 2012. A 6-year-old boy named Taylor Searing walked down to a beach with his stepmother. He never made it back home alive. Taylor had only known this woman for less than a year. She'd recently married his father, Cotton Searing, and by all appearances, she was stepping eagerly into the role of doting stepmom. But this is a case where appearances turned out to be a disguise, and behind that disguise was someone far more dangerous than anyone around Taylor could have imagined. On October 5th, 2012, a 911 call came in from a hospital in Corpus Christi. The woman on the line was Laura Day, and her account was already strange before she'd even finished explaining it. She said she and Taylor had gone out to the Gulf of Mexico that afternoon. According to her version, Taylor got caught in the surf, swallowed water, and slipped under before she could pull him out in time. She claimed she'd eventually gotten him out, rushed him to the car, and driven straight to the hospital. Except the medical evidence didn't line up with the drowning at all. There wasn't the sand in his airway you'd expect. There wasn't the fluid buildup in his lungs that drowning victims typically show. And Taylor's father would later testify that his son was actually a strong swimmer for his age. He'd had regular lessons. So how exactly does a capable young swimmer drown on an outing with a woman who'd barely been part of his life? That question sent investigators digging into Laura Day's history, and what they found was staggering. This wasn't her first brush with a killing. Decades earlier, back in 1982, Laura had been convicted of shooting her boyfriend to death during an argument in Harris County, Texas. She served 2 years before an appeal cut her sentence short. And somehow, she'd carried that history into her marriage with Cotton Searing without him ever knowing. Digging into her online activity revealed something even stranger. Laura had been searching horoscopes, New Age spirituality, theories about reincarnation. One theory investigators floated based on what they found. Laura may have genuinely believed Taylor's soul would simply return in another form. meaning, in her mind, his death wasn't really an ending at all. It was a transformation. When the case went to trial in 2013, prosecutors built their argument around intent. They walked the jury through every inconsistency in her account. How she'd driven right past a closer hospital to reach one nearly 15 minutes farther away. How she never once called 911 during that drive, something almost any panicked parent or guardian would instinctively do. And then there was her demeanor. Witnesses described her as unervingly composed, detached, even flirtatious in the aftermath of a child's death. One nurse on duty said Laura seemed far more focused on herself than on the dying boy in front of her. When Laura took the witness stand, she tried to reframe herself as a grieving, misunderstood woman, insisting she'd loved Taylor, that she'd fought to save him, and that her criminal history had nothing to do with what happened at the beach. The jury didn't buy a word of it. They convicted her of capital murder, and the judge handed down the most severe sentence available: life in prison, no possibility of parole. Laura Day would never see the outside of a cell again. For the Searing family, this was a wound that would never fully close. Cotton had lost his only son. He'd welcomed this woman into their lives, trusted her to protect Taylor, and instead, she became the reason he'd bury him. What kept this case in headlines nationally was how bizarre the details kept getting. And underneath all of it was the simple, brutal fact: Taylor Searing was 6 years old. He had an entire life ahead of him: school, friendships, birthdays, little league games. Within months of Laura Day entering his world, all of that was gone. At sentencing, the judge didn't mince words, calling her crime especially heinous precisely because of the trust she'd violated. A stepmother, the judge said, is supposed to protect and nurture a child, not exploit that position to isolate him and end his life. Even now, there's debate over what actually drove Laura Day to do this. Was it jealousy over the closeness between Taylor and his father? Resentment at suddenly being responsible for someone else's child? Or, like prosecutors suggested, some kind of twisted spiritual justification she'd convinced herself was real? Whatever the true motive was, the outcome doesn't change. A little boy lost his future, and a family was left with wounds that will never fully heal. Segment 3. Mary and Elwyn Crocker Jr. December 2018, Effingham County, Georgia. Deputies pulled up to the Crocker family home expecting a routine welfare check. What they found instead was one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse the state had ever recorded. The visit started with a simple question: where were the two Crocker children? 14-year-old Mary Crocker and her 16-year-old brother. Elwyn Crocker Jr. neighbors had noticed something was off. Some hadn't laid eyes on either kid in years. Their father, Elwyn Crocker Sr., kept giving answers that shifted every time he was asked. Their stepmother, Candace Crocker, mostly stayed quiet. That silence, combined with the inconsistent answers, was enough to raise serious red flags with the deputies on scene. A search warrant followed, and attention quickly turned to the backyard, where investigators noticed patches of soil that looked recently disturbed. What they dug up next was almost too horrifying to process: a shallow grave containing the remains of Mary Crocker. Hours later, a second grave nearby revealed her brother, J.R. Both children had been buried just steps from their own front door, hidden in plain sight, while Candace continued living her daily life directly above where they lay. This wasn't a case of kids running away. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was the end result of long-term abuse, concealed through murder and secret burial, right in the family's own backyard. As investigators pieced together what had actually gone on inside that house, the picture that emerged was horrifying. Testimony described Mary being confined inside a dog cage for extended periods, beaten with belts and pipes, deprived of food, denied any real medical attention, and subjected to constant humiliation. Her brother endured the same treatment. Both children were essentially starved and broken down over time, their deaths ultimately the result of sustained abuse and neglect rather than a single violent moment. Neighbors later admitted they'd picked up on warning signs: Mary looking increasingly thin, increasingly withdrawn. Some suspected something was wrong, but never took it further. And without any consistent check-ins from schools or child welfare services, both children stayed trapped inside that home, completely under their father and stepmother's control. When deputies went through the house after uncovering the graves, they discovered more children still living there, including one with a disability, all in conditions investigators described as inhumane. Those surviving children were pulled out immediately and placed into protective custody. From that point, the real question wasn't whether Candace Crocker bore responsibility. It was how deep that responsibility actually ran. Prosecutors laid out evidence showing she hadn't simply stood by in silence. She'd actively participated. She enforced punishments. She withheld meals. She helped conceal both deaths. Witnesses portrayed her as cold and emotionally checked out, a woman who chose loyalty to her husband over the lives of the children under her roof. The case moved through the legal system relatively fast. In 2022, Candace Crocker pleaded guilty to murder, child cruelty, and concealing a death. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, prosecutors zeroed in on her failure to act, pointing out that a single phone call could have saved both children, and instead she chose silence, then complicity, and ultimately direct participation. The imagery that came out of this case was hard to forget. Local news crews filmed investigators working under portable floodlights in the Crocker backyard, evidence tents pitched over disturbed dirt, deputies in gloves carefully lifting bone fragments from the soil, a coroner's van waiting as remains were carried out in bags. Those images spread nationally, a visual symbol of a horror that had been sitting hidden in plain sight. Public anger deepened further once reporters dug into Elwin Sr.'s background. Before settling in Effingham County, he'd worked ordinary jobs, a retail clerk, and at one point even played Santa Claus at a Disney theme park. To the outside world, he projected warmth and trustworthiness. Behind closed doors, he and Candace had built a home defined by cruelty and death. Candace Crocker's sentencing closed out her role in this story, but the case itself is far from finished. Elwin Crocker Sr. still faces the possibility of the death penalty, and every development in his ongoing trial pulls Candace's name right back into the headlines, permanently linking her to a house sitting on top of two hidden graves. This case leaves behind painful, unresolved questions. How do two children disappear from public life for years without setting off alarms anywhere? How does nobody notice they aren't enrolled in school, aren't receiving medical care? How do two kids slowly waste away while neighbors and agencies fail, again and again, to step in? In the end, responsibility rests with the people inside that house. Candace Crocker wasn't a passive bystander. She chose to stay silent when the abuse began. She chose to participate as it escalated. And she chose concealment when two children ended up buried in the dirt behind her own home. Today, that backyard looks completely unremarkable. Grass has grown back over the graves. The house sits quiet, but underneath that ground is a story that will never be forgotten. Two children whose lives ended in starvation, violence, and silence. Two children betrayed by the very woman who was supposed to protect them. Okay, and what was the reason we were checking on the kids today? Concerns that the children aren't being fed. And based on what I've seen, I can't let this go any longer. I believe those kids are in serious danger.
Okay. And what was the reason we were checking on them?
Concerns that the children aren't being fed.
And done it. I just can't let this go any longer. Those kids, I think, is in very serious danger.
Segment 4. The Hart Family. March 26th, 2018. A white SUV was discovered at the base of a cliff in Mendocino County, California. 8 people had been riding inside. 6 kids and 2 adults. All 8 were dead. At first, this read like an unimaginable accident, a family trip that went horribly wrong. But it took investigators only a matter of days to realize this was no accident at all. It was a murder-suicide orchestrated by the very woman who was supposed to be raising and protecting those 6 children, their adoptive mother, Jennifer Hart. From the outside, Jennifer and her wife, Sarah Hart, looked like the picture of a progressive, loving household. White, vegan, based in Washington State, raising 6 adopted black children. Their social media painted an idyllic scene. Kids holding hands at festivals, matching outfits, captions about peace and unconditional love. Friends genuinely believed they were watching model parents in action. But behind that carefully curated image was a home built on control, starvation, and abuse. The 6 children, Marcus, Hannah, Devontae, Abigail, Jeremiah, and Sierra, had all been adopted out of the foster system in Texas, taken from biological families who were struggling and vulnerable. Jennifer and Sarah presented themselves to the world as rescuers. But once those kids were actually inside their home, the reality looked nothing like the rescue story being told online. Teachers began noticing the children showing up to school visibly hungry, sometimes asking classmates to share food. Hannah once arrived with bruises and told a school nurse she'd been struck with a belt. Devontae, the most vocal of the 6, reached out to neighbors asking for meals and quietly admitted that food was being deliberately withheld from all of them. And every single time authorities started closing in, Jennifer and Sarah had the same response. Pull the kids from school, sever outside contact, and relocate to a new state. The moment that made this family briefly famous happened back in 2014, years before any of this came to light. During a protest in Portland, a photo of Devontae went viral, captured hugging a police officer, visibly in tears. That image spread across the country as a symbol of hope and racial reconciliation. Nobody outside the family knew that Jennifer had orchestrated that embrace. Later on, Devontae quietly told neighbors not to trust what that photo seemed to represent. That life inside their home was nothing like what people online believed. By 2017, red flags were stacking up fast. Child Protective Services in Washington opened multiple investigations into abuse and neglect. Neighbors in the town of Woodland reported the kids looked dangerously thin and desperate. CPS made repeated visits to the house. Every single time, Jennifer and Sarah managed to dodge or delay real scrutiny. But in March of 2018, the walls started closing in. The agency left a notice on the front door, planning to return the following day for a follow-up visit. Jennifer and Sarah understood exactly what that meant. They were out of options. That night, instead of preparing for the visit, they loaded all 6 children into the family's SUV. There was no vacation, no planned trip. Jennifer Hart got behind the wheel and drove south into California, eventually reaching a stretch of coastal highway overlooking the Pacific. And there, she drove the vehicle directly off a 100-foot cliff. The crash was catastrophic. The SUV landed upside down on the rocks far below. Jennifer and Sarah were killed instantly. Several of the children's bodies were recovered near the wreckage. Others were pulled out to sea by the tide and never found. Devontae's body has never been recovered. Toxicology results revealed something chilling. Sarah Hart's system showed elevated levels of an over-the-counter sedative. The children's blood tested positive for the same substance, enough to make them drowsy, though not enough on its own to kill them. Jennifer, who was driving, was heavily intoxicated, well over the legal limit. This wasn't a case of carelessness or an accident born of exhaustion. This was planned. Investigators ultimately ruled it a deliberate murder-suicide. Jennifer Hart had drugged her family and steered them off the edge of the continent. The coroner's inquest that followed painted a devastating picture. Social workers, neighbors, and school staff all described years of documented abuse, neglect, and forced isolation. The crash, investigators concluded, was the final act of control by 2 women who would rather see the children dead than lose custody of them. The case became known nationally as the Hart family tragedy, dissected across documentaries, podcasts, and long-form journalism. Multiple states had received reports of abuse over the years, but the family's constant relocation and carefully managed public image let them slip through every crack in the system. What made this case so infuriating for so many people was what it represented on a broader level. 6 black children placed with white adoptive parents who used them, whether consciously or not, as symbols of a progressive image online, all while quietly starving and beating them behind closed doors. How does a single viral photo of a hug mask years of documented suffering? How does Child Protective Services fail this badly, repeatedly, while children were literally asking neighbors for food. Jennifer Hart's name is now inseparable from that betrayal. She wasn't simply a neglectful parent. She weaponized the entire concept of motherhood, using a carefully built social media presence to project love and progressive values, while her children lived in genuine hunger and fear behind the scenes. The cliff where that SUV went over has since become something of a memorial site, with visitors occasionally leaving flowers and small crosses. For many, it stands as a warning about the danger of trusting a polished public image and the horror of a parent who would rather destroy her children than allow them to be taken from her control. Jennifer Hart will never stand trial. There's no courtroom reckoning waiting for her, no sentencing hearing. Whatever justice exists here was delivered instantly at the bottom of that cliff. But for 6 children who never got a chance to speak for themselves, one question remains unanswered. How many people saw the warning signs along the way and simply chose to look past them? Before we move to the next case, if this kind of deep investigative storytelling is what you come here for, that's exactly what Daily Crime Archive is built around. Subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories properly. Segment 5, Bella Christ. Why did you think it was okay to do the things you did to a little girl? My little girl. I will never get to hear my daughter call me mommy. I will never see her graduate. I will never see her go to college. I will never see her get married. March 2020, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. A 3-year-old named Bella Christ was rushed to the emergency room, unresponsive, badly bruised, and suffering catastrophic internal trauma. Despite the medical team's efforts, Bella died shortly after arriving. The person responsible wasn't a stranger who'd broken into her life. It was her stepmother, Laura Ramirez. Ramirez initially told hospital staff Bella had fallen down a set of stairs. Medical professionals recognized instantly that this story didn't hold up. The injuries were far too extensive, far too severe, to be explained by a single fall. Bella's body told an entirely different story. Serious injuries across her torso, visible facial bruising, and swelling that pointed to repeated trauma rather than one isolated accident. Investigators from the Westmoreland County District Attorney's Office opened a full inquiry, and what they uncovered was a documented pattern of cruelty stretching back months. Bella had been living in a state of constant fear inside what should have been a safe home. Ramirez subjected her to repeated beatings, physical restraint, and isolation from the rest of the family. The abuse eventually escalated into a final assault that ruptured Bella's internal organs and killed her. Prosecutors would later describe what happened to Bella as nothing short of torture. Witnesses testified that Ramirez screamed at the toddler daily, hurled insults at her, and used physical punishment that went far beyond any reasonable definition of discipline. Neighbors admitted they'd heard disturbing sounds coming from the home, but had no idea how severe things had actually become until it was already too late. What made this case particularly chilling was the motive behind it, or rather, the lack of any real motive at all. Ramirez wasn't overwhelmed by circumstance or suffering some kind of breakdown. She simply didn't want Bella around. Friends said she resented having to raise another woman's child, viewing Bella less as a daughter to nurture and more as an obstacle standing between her and her relationship with Bella's father. When the trial opened in 2022, jurors were confronted with the full extent of Ramirez's violence. Photographs of Bella's injuries were entered into evidence. Medical experts walked the courtroom through the level of pain the toddler must have endured before her death. And prosecutors repeatedly emphasized Ramirez's total absence of remorse. Investigators revealed that even as Bella was actively dying, Ramirez delayed getting her medical help. Rather than calling 911 right away, she waited, lied about what had happened, and only brought Bella to the hospital once it was already too late to save her. Prosecutors argued that delay alone demonstrated intent. She had chosen to maintain control of the situation over showing any basic compassion. The jury reached its verdict quickly. Laura Ramirez was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, the judge told her directly that she had stripped a child of her life with a level of cruelty that defied basic humanity. For Bella's biological family, the conviction brought a sense of justice, but not closure. Her mother wept openly in the courtroom, describing Bella as a joyful, affectionate little girl whose life had been cut short before it had really even begun. Members of the community organized candlelight vigils, calling for stronger protective measures for children living in potentially abusive homes. Public outrage over this case was amplified by how preventable it felt in hindsight. Bella's injuries weren't some closely guarded secret. Neighbors, relatives, and acquaintances had all caught glimpses of what was happening, but nobody grasped the full scope of it until it was already too late. The case reignited a broader conversation about whether earlier intervention could have saved her. Laura Ramirez is currently serving her sentence in a Pennsylvania prison, condemned to spend the remainder of her life behind bars. But her name endures as one more example of the evil stepmother archetype playing out in its most horrifying real-world form. Not confined to a fairy tale, but carried out through the actual suffering of a child who should have been completely safe in her care.
Was your mom capable of carrying his body in a suitcase, picking it up, and throwing over a bridge rail in Pensacola, Florida?
Yes.
You still love your mother? I'll strike that, Your Honor.
Segment 6, Gannon-Stotch. Is your mom capable of carrying his body in a suitcase, picking it up, and throwing it off a bridge railing in Pensacola, Florida? Yes. Do you still love your mother? I'll strike that, Your Honor. January 27th, 2020, Colorado Springs, Colorado. 11-year-old Gannon-Stotch was reported missing by his stepmother, Letitia. According to her, he'd gone to play with a friend and simply never came home. In the beginning, it played out like a straightforward runaway case. Flyers went up, search teams combed the area, press conferences ran on repeat. But investigators had already picked up on inconsistencies in Letitia's account, and within weeks, the actual story began surfacing. Gannon hadn't run away at all. He'd been murdered inside his own home by the very woman entrusted with keeping him safe. What followed was an investigation defined by brutality, a desperate cover-up, and a stepmother whose story kept collapsing under its own contradictions. When detectives searched the Stotch home, they found blood spatter in Gannon's bedroom, on the walls, in the carpet underneath his bed. The scope of that evidence made one thing clear to investigators. There was no realistic way Gannon could have survived without immediate emergency medical care. Letitia tried explaining it away with a series of shifting stories. First, she claimed he'd simply cut his foot and bled a little. Forensic analysis proved that theory couldn't possibly be true. Then she claimed he'd left to visit a friend, but no friend had actually seen him that day. Then she claimed they'd gone hiking together and he'd suffered some kind of accident. None of these explanations lined up with the physical evidence investigators were gathering. Meanwhile, neighbors came forward with security camera footage that would become central to the case. One clip showed Gannon climbing into Letitia's truck on the morning of January 27th. Hours later, that same truck returned home, but Gannon was nowhere in sight. As the search dragged on, Letitia's public behavior grew increasingly erratic. She gave rambling media interviews, throwing suspicion at everyone from her husband's ex-wife to unnamed intruders. At one point, she even floated the theory that Gannon had been trafficked, a claim investigators dismissed almost immediately. Rather than actively helping the search effort, she appeared far more focused on protecting herself. 2 months later, the search reached its grim conclusion. Gannon's body was discovered stuffed inside a suitcase, dumped beneath a bridge in Florida, more than 1,300 miles from where he disappeared in Colorado. He had been stabbed 18 times, beaten, and shot once in the jaw. His own stepmother hadn't just killed him. She'd gone to extraordinary, calculated lengths to conceal his body. The 2023 trial exposed the full extent of Letitia's cruelty. Prosecutors walked jurors through the blood evidence, the security footage, and her repeatedly shifting explanations. They argued she'd grown resentful over the burden of caring for Gannon and eventually snapped, turning that resentment into violence. Witnesses described her in court as manipulative and self-absorbed. She maintained her innocence right up through trial, even as the evidence mounted against her, and her defense attempted a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming she suffered from dissociative identity disorder. Psychiatric experts testified that this claim didn't hold up. She was fully aware of her actions. The jury took only a few hours to convict her on charges of first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, and tampering with a corpse. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Gannon's family, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and heartbreak. His father, Albert, sat through the trial listening to every gruesome detail of how his own wife had killed his son. Gannon's biological mother, Landon, spoke through tears, describing her son as a genuinely kind kid who deserved to be remembered for who he was, not for the horrific way his life ended. The public followed this case closely from start to finish. Press briefings from the El Paso County Sheriff's Office drew national coverage. Body camera footage from the day Gannon was first reported missing circulated widely online. And when the actual suitcase used to transport his remains was shown in the courtroom, it became one of the most haunting pieces of evidence presented in recent memory. What sets the Stodge case apart is just how calculated it all was. This wasn't a sudden burst of rage followed by panic. Letitia methodically cleaned blood from the crime scene, transported his body across state lines, and spun an elaborate web of lies to mislead both police and the public. She sat for interviews knowing full well her stepson was already dead, presenting herself publicly as though she were the victim in all of this. The betrayal here runs especially deep. Gannon climbed into that truck, trusting his stepmother would keep him safe. Instead, she turned on him with a knife, a gun, and her own hands. But it wasn't until I heard and saw what you said and did throughout this trial that I think we all truly understood how evil you really are.
But it wasn't until I heard and saw what you said and did in this trial that I think we all realized how evil you really are.
Segment 7. Thomas Valva, January 17th, 2020, Center Mauritius, Long Island. An 8-year-old boy named Thomas Valva collapsed in his father's garage. His body temperature had dropped to just 76 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd been left overnight inside that freezing garage. No warmth, no support, no help. He didn't survive. The woman at the center of this case wasn't Thomas's biological mother. She was his father's fiancée, Angela Polina, a stepmother figure who transformed what should have been a home into something closer to a prison. The abuse had been going on for years. Thomas and his 2 brothers, all 3 on the autism spectrum, were starved, beaten, and humiliated inside the house by Angela and their father, Michael Valva, an NYPD officer who wore a badge in public while running his household like a dictatorship behind closed doors, with Angela acting as his enforcer. Testimony painted a picture of Angela's contempt for the boys from nearly the moment she entered their lives. She reportedly called them disgusting and worse. She forced them to sleep on bare floors, cut off their access to a working bathroom, and locked them outside in freezing conditions as a form of punishment. Teachers at their school repeatedly flagged concerns. The boys were showing up hungry, bruised, and smelling of urine, a direct consequence of being denied bathroom access at home. On the night of January 16, 2020, that pattern of abuse escalated into something fatal. In the grip of a brutal Long Island winter, with temperatures dropping into the teens, Angela and Michael forced Thomas and his brother Anthony out into the garage as punishment for making a mess. There were no blankets, no coats, no heat source of any kind. The boys were trapped in that cold concrete space while the adults slept comfortably inside. By morning, Thomas was in full medical crisis. Surveillance cameras that Angela herself had installed to monitor the boys ended up capturing the horrifying aftermath. Instead of rushing him to a hospital, Angela and Michael hosed him down with cold water in an attempt to clean him up, wasting critical time as his body continued shutting down. By the time he finally reached the hospital, it was already too late. Thomas Valva died of hypothermia. This case rattled all of New York, not just because of the sheer brutality involved, but because Michael Valva was a sworn police officer. That betrayal of public trust hit hard. And yet, when it came time for a jury to weigh in, it was Angela Polina, the stepmother figure, who they determined had played a driving, active role in Thomas's suffering. At trial in 2023, prosecutors laid out just how horrifying daily life inside that house had actually been. They presented the surveillance footage. They read aloud text messages in which Angela referred to the boys using dehumanizing language and mocked their suffering. They revealed she'd cut off heating to parts of the home to save money, fully aware the children would be left to endure the cold as a result. Teachers testified that they'd reported suspected abuse repeatedly, but the system failed to act. Child Protective Services had visited the home on multiple occasions without ever removing the boys. The defense attempted to shift the blame onto Michael, portraying Angela as a passive bystander caught up in someone else's cruelty. The jury didn't accept that framing. The evidence clearly showed her as an active, willing participant. In March of 2023, Angela Polina was convicted of second-degree murder and child endangerment. The judge sentenced her to 25 years to life. Michael Valva was convicted separately and received the same sentence, 25 years to life. At sentencing, the judge's words were unsparing, describing Angela's conduct as inhumane, callous, and utterly without empathy. Public reaction was intense. New York tabloids ran Thomas's smiling face across their front pages. Vigils formed outside the Valva home. The idea of a little boy dying alone in the cold while the adults responsible for him did nothing left communities visibly shaken. The visuals from this case only deepened its impact. Photos of Thomas in his school uniform, smiling, set directly against courtroom footage of Angela staring blankly ahead as the jury's guilty verdict was read aloud. Police handouts, courtroom sketches, and the garage itself all became lasting symbols of this betrayal. For anyone who follows true crime closely, this case is difficult to shake because of just how prolonged the cruelty was. Hypothermia doesn't happen instantly. Thomas would have suffered for hours as his body slowly gave out, shivering until he simply couldn't move anymore. Angela Polina could have stopped it at literally any point. She could have opened that garage door. She could have wrapped him in something warm. She could have called for help. Instead, she chose to do nothing.
The children's bodies were found with just bones left behind because they had been out in the woods for months before being discovered.
Segment 8. Chase and Natalie DeLashmet. The children's bodies were found with just bones left behind because they'd been out in the woods for months before anyone discovered them. Some killers act in a single burst of rage. Others carry their cruelty out slowly, over weeks or months, turning an entire household into something resembling a torture chamber. That's the story of Heather Level Keaton, a woman who stepped into two children's lives as a stepmother figure and ended up on Alabama's death row for what happened to them. In 2010, police in Mobile, Alabama, received a call from a man named John Dylan Adams. He admitted that his two young children, 3-year-old Chase and 4-year-old Natalie, were dead, their bodies hidden in different locations across the state. He pointed directly at his common-law partner, Heather Level Keaton. But as detectives dug into the case, it became clear both adults had participated in one of the most disturbing instances of child abuse Alabama had ever seen. According to court testimony, Chase and Natalie lived in a state of ongoing terror. Heather reportedly resented the children from nearly the moment she entered the household, treating them less like family and more like obstacles. She began by isolating them, locking them in closets, withholding food, forcing them to hold painful positions for hours at a time. When they cried, the punishments only escalated. One especially cruel method involved forcing the children to stand for extended periods while holding heavy objects. If they dropped them, they were beaten. At other points, they were restrained with tape or forced to consume dangerous household chemicals. Chase, the younger of the two, was reportedly made to drink bleach. The children became so visibly malnourished that neighbors began to notice, but as with so many cases like this, the abuse stayed hidden behind closed doors until it was far too late. By the middle of 2010, both children were dead. Chase was killed first, his remains left in a wooded area near Citronelle, Alabama. Natalie was killed months later and left in a separate location closer to the Florida state line. Neither child's remains were discovered until late that year, after John's confession finally brought investigators to the right locations. What made this case even harder to process wasn't only the abuse itself. It was how long it had gone undetected, and how the two adults responsible turned around and blamed each other once it all came to light. John admitted to disposing of both bodies, but insisted Heather was the one driving the abuse. Heather claimed John had been violent and that she'd actually tried to protect the children. The evidence painted a very different picture. Both were culpable, but investigators determined Heather's role was especially severe. At her 2015 trial, prosecutors portrayed her as the primary force behind the abuse. Jurors saw text messages in which she referred to Chase and Natalie in dehumanizing terms and complained openly about having to care for them. Witnesses testified she frequently referred to the children as not mine and made clear she didn't want them living in her home. Experts who evaluated her described her as manipulative and emotionally cold. The jury reached its decision without hesitation. Heather Level Keaton was convicted of capital murder in the deaths of both Chase and Natalie. The judge sentenced her to death, placing her among a small number of women on Alabama's death row. John received a death sentence of his own. For the extended families of Chase and Natalie, the details that emerged at trial were almost unbearable. Photographs of the two children smiling before they'd ever been placed in that household, set against courtroom testimony describing their final months, restrained, starved, beaten, and ultimately killed by the two adults who were supposed to care for them. This case continues to surface periodically in Alabama news, largely because Heather's legal team has pursued multiple rounds of appeals. Each time, the courts have upheld both her conviction and her death sentence. As recently as 2023, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals rejected her latest challenge, keeping her firmly on death row. Public anger toward this case has never really faded. Whenever her name resurfaces, comment sections fill with outrage, many pointing out just how rare it is for women to receive the death penalty in the United States, underscoring how extreme the jury and courts judged her crimes to be. Others focus on the systemic failure that allowed two unstable adults to maintain unchecked control over two children's lives for as long as they did. What sets this case apart within this list is the sheer, sustained sadism involved. This wasn't a sudden loss of control. This was deliberate, repeated torture carried out day after day until two small children's bodies simply gave out. And even faced with overwhelming evidence, Heather never accepted responsibility for what she'd done. Today, she remains at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama. Whether she'll ever actually face execution remains uncertain. But her name will always be tied to one of the most extreme betrayals imaginable. A stepmother who turned her own home into a place defined by fear, abuse, and death.
In June 2020, during the COVID lockdown in England, 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes was murdered by his stepmother, Emma Tustin. His case shocked the nation, not only because of the brutality, but because of the overwhelming evidence of prolonged torture. Arthur's biological mother was in prison at the time, leaving him in the care of his father, Thomas Hughes, and his new partner, Tustin. Instead of protection, Arthur entered a nightmare. The abuse began almost immediately. Arthur was denied food. He was made to stand for up to 14 hours a day in isolation. He was poisoned with salt. He was beaten, humiliated, and cut off from his extended family. Teachers and relatives noticed changes in his behavior before lockdown: weight loss, bruises, visible fear. But once schools closed, the abuse was hidden behind the walls of the Tustin home. Evidence later revealed the full extent of what Arthur endured. Tustin recorded audio clips on her phone where Arthur could be heard crying, "No one loves me. No one is going to feed me." Those words became the defining symbol of his suffering. CCTV cameras inside the home showed Arthur struggling to stand, collapsing as he tried to pick up a duvet from the floor. Instead of helping him, Tustin mocked him. In text messages, she bragged about starving and punishing him. She called him Satan and Devil Spawn. She sent updates to Hughes, who encouraged the cruelty, telling her to just end him. On June 16, 2020, Tustin delivered the fatal attack. Prosecutors said she violently shook Arthur and struck his head against a hard surface. The blow caused devastating injuries. When paramedics arrived, Arthur was unresponsive. He was rushed to Birmingham Children's Hospital, but died the next day. Doctors testified that Arthur's injuries were consistent with repeated shaking and impact trauma. His body also showed signs of chronic neglect, undernourishment, multiple marks, and abnormally high levels of salt in his system. The trial at Coventry Crown Court in late 2021 revealed every grim detail. Prosecutors presented the audio recordings and CCTV clips, forcing the jury to hear Arthur's final words and see his physical collapse. They also presented hundreds of text messages between Tustin and Hughes. In one, Hughes instructed Tustin not to feed Arthur lunch. In another, he encouraged harsher punishments. Tustin's defense argued she had lost control and never intended to kill Arthur. They claimed Hughes pressured her into discipline she couldn't handle, but the evidence demolished those claims. Tustin had documented the abuse herself. She knew what she was doing, and she mocked the suffering of a child as entertainment. The jury convicted Tustin of murder and multiple counts of child cruelty. Hughes was convicted of manslaughter and child cruelty. Tustin received life imprisonment with a minimum of 29 years. Hughes was sentenced to 21 years. The case ignited national outrage. Arthur's face appeared on front pages across Britain. Candlelit vigils were held, with thousands of people leaving flowers, toys, and football memorabilia at makeshift memorials. Comment sections overflowed with anger, many demanding whole-life orders for both Tustin and Hughes. Politicians weighed in. Then Prime Minister Boris Johnson called the case appalling and said it exposed major failings in child protection. Social services had been warned multiple times about Arthur's situation. Relatives had contacted authorities. A teacher raised concerns about bruises and behavior, yet no intervention came. Lockdown restrictions gave Tustin and Hughes total control, and Arthur was left to die in silence. But what makes Arthur's case stand out is the weight of direct evidence. The public didn't just hear second-hand reports. They heard Arthur's own voice on audio recordings. They saw him collapse on CCTV. They read the messages where his father and stepmother plotted his torment. Those recordings strip away any doubt. Arthur was tortured by the people who should have cared for him most. And the cruelty wasn't hidden. It was documented in real time by the killers themselves. Even after conviction, Emma Tustin showed no remorse. Court reporters described her as emotionless during sentencing, avoiding the eyes of Arthur's relatives. She never apologized. She never explained why she'd targeted Arthur so relentlessly. She simply sat in silence, as if the child's suffering meant nothing. Arthur's story has since been used in campaigns for stronger child protection laws. His name appears in parliamentary debates. His photo is carried at rallies. For the public, his words, "No one loves me," remain one of the most haunting reminders of what child abuse looks like when ignored. Emma Tustin now spends her days in a prison cell, despised even among other inmates. But for most people, her punishment will never feel enough, because no sentence can balance the horror of a 6-year-old boy left to starve, cry, and finally die in a house filled with cameras. And Arthur's last words prove the truth. He knew no one was coming to save him. Some of these stepmothers got life. Some even got death. But no punishment will ever equal what their victims endured. These were children who deserved protection, safety, and love. Instead, they got betrayal, torture, and death at the hands of the women they were told to call Mum. The evil stepmother isn't just a fairy tale. It's real. And as these cases show, sometimes the monster is already inside the home. For more true crime documentaries like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story.
Sarah's death was an incident. We are willing to cooperate with the UK authorities and fight our case in court.
I physically punished my daughter and she died.
Segment 9. Sarah Sharif. Sarah's death was an accident. We are willing to cooperate with UK authorities and fight our case in court. August 10th, 2023. A frantic call came in to police in England, placed all the way from Pakistan. On the line was a man named Irfan Sharif, father of a 10-year-old girl named Sarah. He directed officers to his home in Woking, Surrey. When police arrived, they found Sarah alone, lying in her bed. She was bruised, badly injured, and dead. Her stepmother, Bainash Batul, had already fled the country, along with Irfan and 5 other relatives, boarding a flight to Pakistan mere hours before Sarah's body was actually discovered. That escape triggered an international manhunt and turned this case into one of the most notorious child abuse trials in the UK's recent history. The autopsy findings were devastating. Sarah had suffered extensive, wide-ranging injuries, marks across her face, her torso, her limbs. Medical examiners concluded she'd endured sustained abuse over a prolonged period, not the result of a single violent incident. Her official cause of death was recorded as multiple injuries, consistent with harm inflicted repeatedly over time. Prosecutors would later describe what she went through in one word: torture. Neighbors said they'd barely seen Sarah in the months leading up to her death. She'd been pulled out of school, cutting her off from any teacher who might have picked up on the warning signs. Friends who used to play with her no longer saw her outside. She'd become almost entirely isolated, hidden away, completely under the control of her father and stepmother. As investigators reconstructed her final months, it became clear Sarah's life had been defined by fear. Witnesses described Batul as deeply resentful of Sarah, viewing her as an unwanted presence and an outsider within the household. That resentment reportedly worsened significantly in the weeks leading up to Sarah's death, with authorities later presenting evidence of repeated beatings and humiliating punishment disguised as discipline. What pushed this case into international headlines, though, was the escape. While Sarah's body still lay inside that house, her father and stepmother were already on the other side of the world, hiding out in Pakistan. The flight had been booked at the last minute. Relatives there tried to shield the couple from extradition. For weeks, they stayed underground, evading law enforcement, while British and Pakistani authorities coordinated efforts to track them down. In September 2023, footage surfaced of Batul reading from a prepared statement while still in hiding, flatly insisting Sarah's death had been accidental. That video sparked widespread outrage. Viewers pointed to her total lack of visible grief, her emotionless delivery, and the fact that she was speaking publicly while actively refusing to return and face trial. Eventually, under mounting international pressure, Pakistani police arrested Batul, Irfan, and several relatives. All were extradited back to the UK to face charges of murder and child cruelty. The 2024 trial at the Old Bailey exposed the full horror of Sarah's final months. Prosecutors described a sustained campaign of abuse led primarily by Batul, with Irfan an active participant. The court heard how Sarah was regularly beaten, subjected to humiliating punishments, and denied even basic care. One especially chilling detail: Sarah often slept on the floor, bruised and exhausted, while the adults in the house carried on as though nothing was wrong. The presiding judge didn't soften his language. He told both Batul and Irfan they had subjected Sarah to a life defined by cruelty and fear, and that their actions amounted to outright torture. Both were convicted of murder. Irfan received a minimum term of 40 years. Batul received a life sentence with a minimum of 33 years before any possibility of parole. This case reverberated far beyond the UK. Media outlets ran Sarah's smiling school photographs side by side with courtroom images of Batul, her expression cold and unreadable. Police handouts from the scene circulated widely, cementing the case firmly in the public consciousness. Public anger poured out across comment sections, with many calling for even harsher sentencing, while others pointed fingers at the social services system, noting that Sarah had been pulled from school months earlier without any meaningful follow-up. What makes this case especially unsettling is just how recent it is. This didn't happen decades in the past. It happened in 2023 in a modern British city, with every safeguard theoretically already in place. And yet, a 10-year-old girl was tortured to death by the very people responsible for raising her. Sarah Sharif's life ended at 10 years old. Her story will likely be told for years to come, as one more reminder that this kind of cruelty doesn't just exist in fairy tales. Sometimes it lives inside the woman a child is told to call mom. No one loves me. No one's going to feed me. No one's going to beat me. In June of 2020, during the height of England's COVID lockdown, 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes was murdered by his stepmother, Emma Tustin. His case shook the entire country, not just for its brutality, but for the sheer volume of evidence documenting exactly how prolonged and deliberate the torture actually was. Arthur's biological mother was incarcerated at the time, leaving him in the care of his father, Thomas Hughes, and Hughes's new partner, Tustin. Instead of protection, Arthur found himself living a nightmare. The abuse started almost as soon as he moved in. He was denied food. He was forced to stand alone for up to 14 hours a day. He was poisoned with excessive amounts of salt. He was beaten, humiliated, and cut off from the rest of his extended family. Teachers and relatives had noticed warning signs even before lockdown began. Weight loss, bruising, visible fear. But once schools shut down, that abuse disappeared entirely behind closed doors. The evidence that eventually surfaced revealed the full extent of what Arthur endured. Tustin had recorded audio on her own phone that captured Arthur crying out, "No one loves me. No one's going to feed me." Those words became the defining, haunting symbol of everything he went through. Home security cameras captured him struggling just to stand, collapsing as he tried to pick a blanket up off the floor. Rather than helping him, Tustin mocked him. Text messages later showed her bragging about starving and punishing him. She referred to him using cruel, dehumanizing language. She kept Hughes updated throughout, and he actively encouraged the escalating cruelty. On June 16, 2020, Tustin delivered the fatal blow. Prosecutors said she violently shook Arthur and struck his head against a hard surface, causing catastrophic injuries. When paramedics arrived, he was unresponsive. He was rushed to Birmingham Children's Hospital, where he died the following day. Doctors testified that his injuries matched repeated shaking and blunt trauma, and that his body also showed clear signs of chronic neglect, malnutrition, old bruising, and dangerously elevated salt levels. The trial at Coventry Crown Court in late 2021 laid every detail bare. Prosecutors played the audio recordings and security footage for the jury, forcing them to hear Arthur's final desperate words and watch him physically collapse on camera. They also introduced hundreds of text messages exchanged between Tustin and Hughes. In one, Hughes instructed her not to feed Arthur lunch. In another, he pushed for even harsher punishment. Tustin's defense argued she'd simply lost control and never intended to kill him, claiming Hughes had pressured her into disciplinary methods she couldn't manage. The evidence dismantled that argument almost immediately. She had documented the abuse herself, in her own words, and had mocked a child's suffering as though it were entertainment. The jury convicted Tustin of murder along with multiple counts of child cruelty. Hughes was convicted of manslaughter and child cruelty. Tustin received a life sentence with a minimum of 29 years. Hughes received 21 years. The case ignited national outrage across Britain. Arthur's photograph appeared on front pages nationwide. Candlelit vigils drew thousands of mourners who left flowers, toys, and football memorabilia at makeshift memorials. Comment sections overflowed with anger, with many calling for whole life sentences for both defendants. Political leaders weighed in as well. The sitting prime minister at the time called the case appalling, saying it exposed serious failures within the child protection system. Social services had, in fact, been warned about Arthur's situation multiple times. Relatives had reached out to authorities directly. A teacher had flagged concerns about visible bruising and behavioral changes. None of it triggered meaningful intervention. Lockdown gave Tustin and Hughes total, unchecked control, and Arthur was left to die in isolation. What sets Arthur's case apart is the sheer weight of direct evidence involved. The public wasn't relying on secondhand accounts. People heard Arthur's actual voice in those recordings. They watched him collapse on camera. They read the messages in which his own father and stepmother coordinated his suffering. That evidence eliminated any room for doubt. Arthur was tortured by the two people who should have cared for him most, and that cruelty wasn't hidden from documentation. It was recorded in real time by the people carrying it out. Even after her conviction, Emma Tustin showed no visible remorse. Court reporters described her as emotionless throughout sentencing, avoiding eye contact with Arthur's family. She never apologized. She never offered any explanation for why she targeted him so relentlessly. She simply sat in silence, as though his suffering had meant nothing at all. Arthur's case has since become a reference point in campaigns pushing for stronger child protection laws across the UK, referenced repeatedly in parliamentary debate and carried on signs at public rallies. His words, "No one loves me," remain one of the most haunting summaries of what unchecked child abuse actually looks like. Emma Tustin now spends her days behind bars, reportedly despised even among fellow inmates. But for most people who followed this case, no sentence will ever feel like enough, because there is no punishment that can balance out the horror of a 6-year-old boy left to starve, cry, and ultimately die inside a house full of cameras that recorded every second of it. Arthur's final words prove he already understood the truth, that no one was coming to save him. Some of the women in these cases received life sentences. Some received death sentences. But no punishment, however severe, will ever equal what these children actually endured. These were kids who deserved safety, protection, and love. Instead, each of them was met with betrayal, abuse, and death at the hands of the very women they were told to call mom. The evil stepmother isn't just a fairy tale archetype. As these 9 cases make painfully clear, it's a real and recurring horror. And sometimes, the most dangerous person in a child's life is already living inside their own home. If you want more deep-dive true crime investigations like this one, this is Daily Crime Archive. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case we cover.